They say Henry VIII could destroy anyone. A courtier who angered him vanished in a week. A wife who disappointed him vanished in a month. A friend who questioned him vanished overnight. England lived under a king whose temper could rewrite laws, shatter alliances, and end lives with the flick of a quill. Yet there was one woman he could never touch, a queen he abandoned, a wife he rejected, a political obstacle he devoted 7 relentless years to breaking, a woman he wanted gone more desperately than anyone else in his life. And still, she died peacefully, in her bed, untouched by the blade that killed Anne Boleyn. Why? Why did Henry VIII? A man who executed wives, destroyed ministers, burned monks, and terrorized Parliament, suddenly hesitated? What shield protected Catherine of Aragon, a woman without an army, without a faction, without a throne? And what truth did Henry fear so deeply that he dared not lay a finger on her? Tonight, the secret will be revealed, the secret of the emperor whose power stretched across continents, whose name made Henry VIII tremble, and whose protection turned Catherine into the one Tudor queen no executioner could touch. Before we descend into courtrooms, betrayals, and imperial threats, like this video, share it, and subscribe to Hidden Crowns, because every layer we peel back brings us closer to truths darker than the last. Now, return with me to the moment where everything began. A courtroom in Blackfriars, a king ready to win, and a queen who stood, walked forward, and made history tremble. They say kings shape empires, but in the Tudor world, it was bloodlines that shaped kings, and one bloodline held more weight than England itself. To understand why Catherine of Aragon lived while Anne Boleyn died, why one queen survived Henry VIII's fury while another queen's head fell under the French sword, we must step into a world where kings are not the apex of power, but pieces on a much larger board. The fall of Anne Boleyn began the moment her enemies sharpened their knives. But the survival of Catherine of Aragon, the queen Henry VIII spent 7 years trying to destroy, began long before her marriage, long before her trial, long before Henry ever laid eyes on Anne Boleyn. It began with a boy born in Ghent, a boy who would grow into the most powerful man in Europe, a man whose shadow covered continents. Charles V, the nephew Catherine called my son in spirit. The one name Henry VIII could not say without feeling the edges of fear. The emperor whose empire wrapped England in a geopolitical chokehold so tight that not even Henry, vengeful, impulsive, brutal Henry, could break free. The contrast is so sharp, it almost feels fictional. Anne Boleyn, clever, modern, charismatic, politically daring, was executed within hours of her trial. One moment she was Queen of England, the next she was headless at the Tower. Catherine of Aragon, older, exiled, abandoned, stripped of her crown and jewels, died peacefully in her bed at Kimbleton, her rosary wrapped between her fingers, her dignity intact. Anne had youth, wit, ambition, and alliances inside Henry's court. She was the rising star of Tudor England. Catherine had none of those things. Her allies had been pushed out. Her supporters were threatened. Her daughter was taken from her. Her letters were monitored. Her household was reduced. Her finances slashed. Her movements controlled. And still, she lived. Henry VIII, who executed servants, nobles, bishops, and wives with the flick of a wrist, did not dare execute Catherine. Why? Because to harm her was to challenge the one man Henry feared, the only man Henry feared, Charles V. To the people of the 16th century, Charles V was not simply a monarch. He was a phenomenon, a force of nature, a political storm. Henry VIII ruled a single kingdom. Charles V ruled a map. Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, the Holy Roman Empire, Naples, Sicily, Milan, the colonies of the New World. A sweep of territories so vast it was said the sun never set on his empire. And that empire had teeth. Armies larger than England's entire population, fleets that patrolled the Mediterranean and Atlantic, treasuries filled with gold from the Americas. Charles was not born into simple royalty. He was forged in dynastic fire, grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, the conquerors of Granada, scion of the Habsburgs, heir to the Burgundian court of wealth and steel. And Catherine of Aragon was his blood, not by marriage, not by diplomacy, by birth. She was the daughter of Isabella of Castile. Charles was the son of her sister, Juana. Their bloodline was the bedrock of Spanish legitimacy. This meant that a threat to Catherine was a threat to Spain, and therefore a threat to the empire. Henry VIII did not admit this publicly. He never would. But ambassadors recorded it in letters, courtiers whispered it in corridors, and even Cromwell acknowledged it privately. The king dare not touch the queen for fear of the emperor. This is not speculation. It is documented fear. The year was 1525. The battleground, Pavia. Charles V's forces crushed the French army in a humiliation so complete that it echoed across Europe like thunder. The King of France, Francis I, was captured alive, held like a trophy, forced to write letters begging for mercy, dragged through negotiations like a pawn. Europe trembled. If Charles could capture the King of France, what could he do to England, to Henry? Suddenly the geopolitical map shifted. France, England's centuries-old enemy, was broken, and Henry VIII realized something terrifying. If Charles V wanted to take England, no one could stop him. The Empire could cross the Channel. The Empire could burn London. The Empire could dethrone Henry just as easily as it had dethroned others. Henry was reckless, but he was not stupid. He bowed his head in letters. He flattered Charles V publicly. And he did not touch Catherine. Not yet. In 1529, Catherine stepped into the Blackfriars courtroom not as a wronged wife, but as a political storm given human form. Henry expected her to plead, to cry, to surrender. Instead, Catherine walked straight past the judges and knelt before Henry. "Sir, I have been your wife for 20 years. That sentence alone was enough to wound his pride, but what followed cut deeper than any sword. When you took me, I was your brother's wife in name only. A direct assault on the foundation of Henry's annulment. The courtroom gasped. Henry's face burned crimson. But Catherine was not done. She rose, turned her back on him, and walked away from the King of England. No queen had ever done that. She did not return to court. She did not acknowledge its authority. She did not accept its verdict. Why? Because Catherine was not playing by English rules anymore. She was playing by imperial rules. Henry claimed their marriage was invalid because she had been married to Arthur. Catherine seized that logic like a blade. If the marriage was invalid, then she was not Henry's wife, not Henry's subject, not under Henry's law. She was, legally and politically, a Spanish princess residing in England, a foreign royal. And foreign royalty could not be harmed without papal sanction, imperial negotiation, and the approval of the Spanish crown. Any attempt to touch her would trigger war with Charles V, excommunication, international backlash, diplomatic collapse. Catherine had taken the very argument Henry built to rid himself of her and used it to construct a shield he could not penetrate. It was the most brilliant political reversal a Tudor queen ever performed. In 1527, something extraordinary happened. Rome was attacked. Not by pirates, not by bandits, by soldiers loyal to Charles V. The Pope himself was taken prisoner. This meant that when Henry applied for an annulment, the Pope could not grant it, not because he sided with Catherine, but because he feared the emperor who held him hostage. It was the greatest political advantage Catherine ever received, one Henry could do nothing about. Catherine did not need armies. She did not need allies. She had the Pope's shackles. She had Charles's wrath. She had a legal identity that no English king could rewrite. Henry was trapped. The comparison is brutal. Anne Boleyn was brilliant, but she was alone. She had no international protection, no royal bloodline, no foreign crown behind her. Her power existed only as long as Henry loved her. The moment he stopped, she was doomed. Catherine was not alone. She was not dependent on Henry. She did not need his love or favor. Her power came from Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Rome, her birthright, her legal brilliance, her unshakable identity. Anne belonged to Henry. Catherine belonged to the world, and Henry could not fight the world. Henry tried everything. He stripped Catherine of titles, moved her to cold, isolated castles, cut her income, reduced her household, separated her from Mary, refused her letters, sent envoys to pressure her, threatened her with the king's displeasure, the Tudor phrase for death. But Catherine never broke. She wrote letters dripping with dignity. She invoked her mother, Isabella of Castile. She invoked God. She invoked the law. She invoked Charles V. She invoked Rome. And every invocation reminded Henry she was untouchable. Not because she was gentle, not because she was righteous, not because Henry ever loved her. She survived because her bloodline made her dangerous. Because harming Catherine of Aragon would unleash consequences no Tudor king could control. Because behind her stood an empire that Henry VIII never dared challenge. But the true brilliance, the true terror of Catherine's protection was not simply Charles V's power, nor the Pope's fear, nor her bloodline. Because Catherine of Aragon understood something Anne Boleyn never did. Henry VIII could not bear looking like a villain in the eyes of Europe. He could kill a wife as long as Europe called it justice. He could break with Rome as long as Europe called it courage. He could execute nobles, monks, advisors, as long as Europe called it a necessity. But Catherine? If Henry harmed her, Europe would call it cowardice. Spain would call it betrayal. Rome would call it sin. And Charles V would call it war. That was Catherine's battlefield, not England, not Henry's court, but all of Europe. She moved the conflict from a king's household to an entire continent. Henry ruled a kingdom. Catherine belonged to an empire. Henry had courtiers. Catherine had emperors. Henry had proclamations. Catherine had bloodlines. And that imbalance became Henry's greatest humiliation. But Catherine's protection did more than shield her body. It wounded Henry's pride in a way no sword could. Because every day Catherine lived, every day she refused to bow, every day she signed her letters Queen of England, Henry VIII was reminded that he could not bend the world to his will. It is one thing for a king to be resisted. It is another thing to be defeated by a woman he believed he had already cast aside. And Catherine defeated him not with armies, not with strategy, but with endurance. The court saw it, Europe saw it, Henry saw it most of all. Every ambassador wrote the same line in their reports: "The Queen's constancy grows stronger than the King's fury." That sentence spread across Europe like wildfire. Imagine what it did to Henry VIII's ego. The man who believed himself chosen by God, the man who broke 1,000 years of religious authority, the man who destroyed anyone who challenged him, was being outmaneuvered by the wife he no longer wanted. And the cruelest cut? Henry VIII could not silence her voice. Because Catherine's letters did not flow through English channels, they flowed through Spain, through Rome, through the emperor's private couriers. Every message she sent was a dagger aimed at Henry's reputation. Every appeal she filed in Rome was a reminder that she was still a queen in the eyes of Christendom. Henry could take away her jewels. He could take away her daughter. He could take away her palaces, her attendants, her income. But he could not take away her name. And Catherine of Aragon weaponized that name with a precision Anne Boleyn never understood. Anne wielded seduction. Catherine wielded legitimacy. Anne promised sons. Catherine embodied dynasties. Anne stood on passion. Catherine stood on lineage. And deep inside Henry, beneath the fury, beneath the arrogance, beneath the hunger for sons, lived a truth he could never admit. He feared Catherine's righteousness more than Anne's ambition. One queen challenged his desires. The other challenged his authority. One queen complicated his marriage. The other threatened his kingdom. And that is why Catherine, even in exile, even in sickness, even stripped of wealth and power, became the one woman Henry VIII could not crush. Because to destroy Catherine was to destroy the illusion that Henry VIII was untouchable. And Henry could survive many things: rebellion, betrayal, even God's wrath. But he could not survive humiliation. Not from a queen. Not from a wife. And certainly not from a daughter of Isabella of Castile. Catherine of Aragon died on a cold January morning in 1536. No trumpets, no public mourning, no courtiers lining the halls with candles, no king standing vigil. Instead, a forgotten manor in the countryside, a handful of loyal servants, and a queen lying quietly in a room that once belonged to someone else. The woman who had entered England with the promise of empire now lay dying in a house meant for widows. But she was not broken. Even in her final hours, she held her dignity the way other queens held swords. Before she died, Catherine dictated one last message, a letter to Henry VIII himself. It was not a plea, not a curse, not even a rebuke. It was a declaration of moral superiority. She wrote, "My eyes desire you above all things." A sentence so gentle, so devastating, it hit Henry harder than any accusation could. She forgave him, the one thing he could not bear. Catherine, lying on a simple bed, denied him the dramatic ending he wanted. The scene where she cursed him, raged at him, made herself small. Instead, she died as she lived, a queen in spirit, even when stripped of her crown. Forgiveness became her final weapon, and Henry VIII, King of England, Lord of men, breaker of wives, was left defenseless against it. Ambassadors wrote that when Henry read her letter, his face turned white. He locked himself in his chambers. He refused food. He ranted that someone had poisoned her. A man capable of executing one wife and replacing another was suddenly terrified that Catherine might haunt him. And she did. Not with a knife, but with memory. When Catherine's body was examined,
observers reported something strange. Her heart was black. Blackened, shriveled, mottled like burned leather. Immediately, rumors spread. Poison, assassination, a final act of revenge from Anne Boleyn's faction. But the truth remains elusive. Some say it was cancer. Others say years of stress and starvation. Some insist it was simply decay. Yet when the blackened heart was opened and examined, there was no trace of poison. Just a dark mystery that historians still argue about. This, too, became part of Catherine's legend. In life, she was untouchable. In death, she became unknowable. And Henry VIII, a man who lived in a world of certainties he invented, could not bear uncertainties he did not control.
Catherine died in January. By May, Anne Boleyn would meet the sword. The contrast is cruel. One queen died quietly in bed, still loved across Europe, still recognized by Rome, still protected by an emperor. The other died publicly, beheaded by a foreign executioner, eyes wide open, betrayed by a king who had once risked everything for her. 2 women, 2 fates, 1 man. Catherine's death did not merely end her suffering, it ended her protection. With Catherine gone, Charles V had no reason to shield Anne Boleyn, no reason to restrain Henry, no reason to intervene. For years, Anne's downfall had been prevented by Catherine's existence and by Charles's silent fury. But when Catherine died, something shifted in the European power balance. Now, Henry VIII was no longer threatening the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor. He was discarding an English-born queen with no army and no empire behind her. Anne became mortal again. Catherine's death changed more than marriages, more than alliances, more than crowns. It changed the soul of England. Without Catherine, Anne fell. Jane Seymour rose. The Reformation accelerated. Mary's legitimacy crumbled. Elizabeth was thrown into danger. Henry VIII became increasingly unstable. Everything that happened afterward, every execution, every annulment, every political earthquake, echoed from the silence Catherine left behind. Kings rule nations, but queens shape destinies. And Catherine shaped England by simply refusing to break. After her death, Henry forbade the court from wearing mourning black. He declared she was no longer queen. He banned official funerals. He tried desperately to shrink her legacy. But Catherine had already become something more powerful than any title he could strip away. She became a symbol. A martyr to some, a saint to others, a heroine to millions of women who watched her stand against the most powerful man in England and refuse to bow. Catherine of Aragon outlived Henry's cruelty, not in years, but in memory. Anne Boleyn is remembered for her fall, Jane Seymour for her death, Catherine Howard for her tragedy, Catherine Parr for her survival. But Catherine of Aragon? She is remembered for her endurance. She became the queen who would not yield, the queen who would not confess, the queen who lived and died without ever allowing Henry VIII to define her.
And that is a power no man, not even Henry, could strip away.
And now we return to the heart of this story, the unanswered question that lingers in every Tudor historian's mind. Why did Catherine live while Anne died? Was it justice? Was it diplomacy? Was it the will of God, the luck of birth, the shield of the empire? Or was it something darker, a reminder that queens, like nations, are only as safe as the men who fear losing them? Catherine of Aragon survived not because Henry was merciful, but because Henry was afraid. Afraid of war, afraid of Charles V,
afraid of political ruin, afraid of striking a woman whose bloodline could summon armies. And that fear, that invisible shield, saved her life. But it also doomed countless others. Because after Catherine died, Henry VIII no longer feared anyone. Not Rome, not Spain, not Europe, not God. A king who loses fear becomes a king capable of anything.
And that is the true cost of Catherine's death.
Was Catherine of Aragon the most powerful, powerless woman in history? Did Charles V protect her out of love, duty, or empire? And what is the price of being a queen protected by a man more feared than the king she married? Tell us what you think. Was Catherine fortunate, or was she simply the right pawn in the right empire at the right time? Do you believe Catherine survived because she was righteous, or because she was untouchable? History remembers kings who rule. We remember the queens who endure.